The biting winds of November 10, 1943 whipped across the tarmac of Germany's primary Luftwaffe aircraft testing facility. A palpable tension hung in the air, a silent prelude to the storm that was brewing. Chief Test Pilot Hans Vera Lurch, a man whose very existence was defined by the raw embrace of speed and steel, strode with grim determination toward a grotesque intruder. It was a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, captured just 2 weeks prior, now squatting like an insult, a metallic gargoyle mocking German engineering sensibilities. Its squat bulbous fuselage earned it the derisive nickname Flying Milk Bottle from the Reich's proud sleek-winged pilots. Lurch had devoured the intelligence briefings, each word a testament to a prevailing, dangerous arrogance. American aircraft were dismissed as crude, mass-produced contraptions churned out by a nation better suited to churning out refrigerators than fighting machines. The P-47, they claimed, was the zenith of this mediocrity, heavy, unsophisticated, a brutish beast relying solely on raw power. How different they boasted from the precision instruments of the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, elegant dancers of death. The P-47, by contrast, was declared a mere sledgehammer. But Lurch, with his engineer's mind and pilot's intuition, harbored a growing unease, a premonition that something far more insidious lurked beneath the surface of this perceived clumsiness. He was about to embark on a flight that would shatter every preconception, an aerial baptism by fire that would expose a profound, almost terrifying truth. The Americans hadn't built a crude aircraft. They had forged something far more dangerous, something profoundly practical. An aircraft not for the glory of aces, but for the relentless grinding machinery of armies. Not for breaking records, but for breaking enemies, through sheer overwhelming numbers and relentless operational availability. Within 90 minutes, Lurch would pen a report destined to be filed away and ignored a Cassandra's warning, lost in the din of denial. But history, in its brutal, unforgiving way, would prove him devastatingly right. Germany was building fighters for individual excellence, a noble but ultimately futile pursuit. America, with its flying milk bottles, was building fighters for industrial war. And in the crucible of total war, this difference, this stark philosophical chasm, would prove utterly decisive. Hans Vera Lurch had been flying since childhood. Born in 1,916 inches, Brelau, he'd started with gliders in the early 1,930 seconds, working his way up through sheer determination despite his family's limited means. When Hitler came to power, and Germany began its secret rearmament, Leah found opportunities opening up. By 1939, he was a test pilot at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's equivalent of the American Wright Field or the British Varnbur. Unlike combat pilots who flew one or two aircraft types extensively, Lurch flew everything. New German prototypes production aircraft captured enemy planes. His logbook would eventually record over 120 different aircraft types. He was a trained aeronautical engineer, and his reports were known for brutal technical honesty. When an aircraft was inadequate, he said so. When an enemy design was superior, he documented it. This honesty had made him some enemies among Nazi officials, who preferred optimistic assessments to accurate ones. But his expertise was too valuable to dismiss. If Hans Vera said an aircraft was good or bad, people listened, even if they didn't always like what they heard. The P-47 Thunderbolt, sitting on the Rechlin tarmac, had an interesting story. Its pilot, Lieutenant William Roach, of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, had gotten lost in bad weather during an escort mission on November 7, 1943. His entire flight had become desperately low on fuel. The flight leader crash-landed on a beach. Another pilot bailed out over the North Sea. Only one made it back to England barely. Roach had spotted what he thought was an airfield in southern England. He landed safely, followed a ground vehicle to a parking area, and shut down his engine. Only then did he realize the horrible truth. He wasn't in England. He was at a Luftwaffe base in Caen, France. German soldiers approached with weapons drawn. Roach was now a prisoner of war. His aircraft, nicknamed Beetle, was now German property. The Luftwaffe had moved quickly. Allied fighters prowled the skies, strafing any valuable target. Beetle was flown inland to Rechlin before American or British fighters could destroy it. Now it sat waiting for evaluation, painted in Luftwaffe camouflage, with the code T9+FK, the marking of the famous Zircus Rosarius demonstration unit. Lurch had heard the dismissive comments from other pilots. The P-47 was a joke. Too heavy, too big, too American. It represented everything wrong with American design philosophy. Crude, unrefined, relying on massive engines to compensate for poor aerodynamics. But Lurch had learned not to trust first impressions. He'd flown enough captured Allied aircraft to know that British and American engineers were highly competent. If they designed an aircraft this way, they had reasons. His job was to understand those reasons. As he approached Beetle, he noted the sheer size. The radial engine was enormous, the fuselage built around it like a barrel. The landing gear was thick and robust. Everything about the aircraft screamed heavy. German fighters were sleek, elegant, optimized for agility and performance. This thing looked like it had been designed by shipbuilders, not aircraft engineers. Lurch began his walkout inspection. The construction quality was immediately apparent. Clean welds, precise panel gaps, high-grade materials throughout. This wasn't crude manufacturing. This was sophisticated mass production. And there was a difference. The aircraft had been built to tolerances that German factories, increasingly stretched thin by the war, were struggling to maintain. Lurch climbed into the cockpit and immediately understood why German pilots had been complaining. The cockpit was huge, absolutely enormous, compared to the cramped confines of a Bf-109. A German pilot, accustomed to his aircraft fitting like a tight glove, would feel lost in all this space. But as Lurch settled into the seat, he realized something. This wasn't a flaw. This was deliberate design. In a Bf-109, Lurch had to crouch to avoid continually banging his head on the canopy. The cockpit was so tight that instrument access was difficult, and long missions were physically exhausting. German engineering philosophy prioritized performance. If pilot comfort suffered, that was acceptable. The P-47 cockpit was comfortable, not just adequate, but genuinely comfortable. The seat was well padded. There was room to move, to stretch, to adjust position during long flights. The canopy was high and clear, providing excellent visibility. Everything was within easy reach, without straining. Lurcher began examining the instruments and controls. Here was something remarkable. The instrument panel used color coding. Red and green sections marked acceptable operating ranges for the engine. A pilot could monitor engine status at a glance without reading the actual numbers. Then, L understood why. According to intelligence reports, American fighter units included pilots from multiple countries. Free French, Polish, even some pilots who barely spoke English. The color coding meant that a pilot who couldn't read English could still operate the aircraft safely. Green meant good. Red meant danger, universal and intuitive. It was brilliant. Not from a pure engineering standpoint, but from an operational standpoint. German instruments required precise understanding of specifications and limits. The P-47 was designed so that a pilot with minimal training could operate it safely. This wasn't crude engineering. This was inclusive engineering design that acknowledged human factors. Lurch continued his inspection. The control layout was logical and well organized. The throttle mixture control and propeller pitch were all grouped together on the left side. The fuel system controls were clearly labeled. Everything was designed for ease of use. German fighters were designed for expert pilots. The Bf-109 was notoriously difficult to handle on takeoff and landing, with a narrow landing gear that made ground loops common. It took skill to master. The Luftwaffe accepted this because their training program produced skilled pilots. But Lurch knew that by late 1943, the Luftwaffe's training program was collapsing. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal flight time before being thrown into combat. The elaborate training that had produced expert pilots in 1939 and 1940 no longer existed. Germany needed aircraft that novice pilots could fly safely, but they were still building aircraft for aces. Lurch went through the pre-flight checklist. The manual was clear and comprehensive, with step-by-step procedures. German manuals assumed pilot expertise. American manuals assumed pilot ignorance and explained everything in detail. He started the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R280 double wasp roared to life with a distinctive sound. And then Lurch noticed something that would become a recurring theme in his evaluation. The engine ran smoothly, beautifully smoothly. He'd flown enough American aircraft to recognize this pattern. American engines were consistently smooth and reliable. German engines, particularly late in the war, were increasingly temperamental. Manufacturing quality varied between factories. Replacement parts didn't always fit properly. Engines that ran perfectly when new developed problems after minimal use. The R-2800 idled like it could run forever. No vibration, no rough spots, no concerning sounds. Just smooth, powerful operation. This was mass production at a level Germany couldn't match. Building one perfect engine in a laboratory was one thing. Building thousands of consistently reliable engines is something else entirely. Lurchers received clearance and taxied toward the runway. Here was another revelation. The P-47's landing gear was broad and robust. The tail wheel locked into place, keeping the aircraft tracking straight. Taxiing was easy, visibility was good, and the aircraft felt stable. In a Bf-109, ground handling was a constant challenge. The narrow landing gear made the aircraft unstable. Visibility over the nose was poor. Inexperienced pilots frequently ground looped during taxi or landing, damaging the aircraft even without enemy action. The Luftwaffe accepted these characteristics as the price of high performance. The P-47 was designed to be operated from rough forward airfields by pilots of varying skill levels. The robust landing gear could absorb hard landings. The good ground handling meant fewer accidents. In his memoir, Lurch would later write about forgetting to lock the tail wheel once and nearly ground looping but catching it just in time. The fact that he could catch it, that the aircraft was forgiving enough to save, would have been impossible in a Bf-109. Lurch lined up on the runway and advanced the throttle. The acceleration was impressive. The massive engine pushed the heavy fighter forward with authority. The takeoff run was longer than a German fighter, but not excessively so. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, and Lurch retracted the landing gear. Climbing to altitude, Lurch tested handling characteristics. The P-47 was not agile in the German sense. It didn't turn tightly. It didn't have the instantaneous response of a Bf-109 or FW-190, but it was stable, predictable, and solid. Lurch experimented with the flaps at safe altitude. As he'd noted in his memoir, the hydraulic system worked smoothly. Everything functioned as designed. There were no quirks, no unexpected behaviors, no systems that required careful management. This was the pattern emerging. The P-47 wasn't the most agile fighter. It wasn't the fastest at low altitude. It didn't excel in traditional dogfighting, but it was competent in all areas, reliable in all systems, and forgiving of pilot errors. German fighters were temperamental thoroughbreds. The P-47 was a workhorse, and Lurch was beginning to understand that in industrial warfare, workhorses won. At altitude L tested performance. Above 15,000 feet, the P-47's turbo supercharger came into its element. The aircraft accelerated smoothly and maintained power where German fighters were gasping in the thin air. The dive performance was impressive. The roll rate was excellent for an aircraft this size. Lurch flew for about 90 minutes, putting the Thunderbolt through various maneuvers. The aircraft never surprised him negatively. Everything worked as it should. The engine never faltered. The controls remained responsive. The systems remained functional. And that was when Lurch understood the deeper truth. The P-47 wasn't designed to be the ultimate fighter. It was designed to be the ultimate operational fighter. There was a difference, and it was profound. German engineers designed for peak performance. American engineers designed for sustained operations. A Bf 109 inches perfect condition flown by an expert pilot might outperform a P-47 in a dogfight. But how often was a German fighter in perfect condition? How often were pilots experts? How often could mechanics perform the precise maintenance required? The P-47 was designed assuming that maintenance would be performed by mechanics of varying skill levels using parts from different production batches under field conditions, possibly under enemy fire. It was designed assuming that pilots might be tired, stressed, wounded, or undertrained. It was designed assuming that aircraft would take battle damage and need to keep flying. Every design decision made sense. Once Lay understood this philosophy. The robust construction, the forgiving handling, the intuitive controls, the reliable engine, all of it served operational availability. Lurch returned to Rechlin and landed. The landing was straightforward. The robust landing gear absorbing the touchdown smoothly, he taxied back to the hangar and shut down the engine. Ground crew members gathered around, eager for his assessment. What did he think of the grotesque American fighter? Lurcher climbed out and stood looking at the aircraft for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them. "It's the best designed operational fighter I've ever flown." The mechanics looked confused. Best designed. It was huge, heavy, inelegant. How could it be well designed? "It's not designed for performance," Lurch explained. "It's designed for operations, and there's a difference." That evening, Lurch sat at his desk and began writing his technical report. This was always the most important part of his job. Flying the aircraft was one thing. Understanding what it meant strategically was another. He organized his report into sections: performance handling systems and strategic assessment. In the performance section, he documented the facts objectively. The P-47 was fast at altitude, slow at low altitude. Dive performance was excellent. Turning performance was adequate but not exceptional. Rate of climb was good. High altitude performance was outstanding due to the turbo supercharger. In the handling section, he noted the stable, predictable characteristics: easy ground handling, forgiving flight behavior, good visibility, comfortable cockpit for long-duration missions. In the system section, he detailed the color-coded instruments, the intuitive control layout, the robust construction, the smooth, reliable engine. But it was in the strategic assessment section that Lurch wrote something that would later prove prophetic. Even though his report would be filed and ignored, the P-47 Thunderbolt represents a fundamentally different design philosophy from German fighters. German aircraft are optimized for peak performance and assume expert pilots and maintenance. The P-47 is optimized for operational reliability and assumes average pilots and field maintenance. This aircraft is designed to be operated in large numbers by pilots of varying skill levels. The forgiving handling means fewer accidents. The robust construction means more aircraft return from missions. The reliable engine means more uptime and less maintenance. The intuitive controls mean faster training. Most significantly, every design decision prioritizes sustained operations over peak performance. The Americans have not built the best fighter. They have built the most operational fighter, and they can produce it in numbers we cannot match. Lurch paused, considering how to phrase his conclusion. He knew it would be controversial, possibly even dangerous, but accuracy was more important than comfort. Assessment. The P-47 is not crude engineering. It is sophisticated operational engineering. Germany builds fighters for individual excellence. America builds fighters for industrial war. If the Americans can field hundreds of these aircraft flown by adequately trained pilots, our numerical and qualitative advantages will be negated through sheer operational availability. Recommendation: German fighter design philosophy must incorporate operational reliability as a primary requirement, not a secondary consideration. We cannot win an attrition war against an enemy that can keep more aircraft operational more consistently. Lurch signed his report, a stark, uncomfortable truth, laid bare on the page, and submitted it through channels. It was read, it was discussed, and then inevitably it was filed away, dismissed, as the overly pessimistic rantings of a pilot perhaps demoralized by flying enemy aircraft. German fighters, the high command insisted, were superior. American engineering was crude. End of discussion. But the grim reaper of Lurch's predictions began to harvest almost immediately. By early 1944, the skies above Germany were swarming. P-47 Thunderbolts. Those flying milk bottles arrived in formations so vast, they blotted out the sun, escorting American bombers deep into the Reich. They kept coming, day after relentless day mission, after brutal mission. Luftwaffe pilots, the cream of German air power, intercepted them, sometimes scoring victories. But the next day, there were always more. P-47 seconds. Always more. Frustration festered within the German ranks. They would damage P-47 seconds that by all rights should have disintegrated only to watch them limp defiantly home. They would shoot down an American pilot one day, only to face a fresh new one in an equally fresh P-47 the very next. The supply, it seemed, was endless. Meanwhile, Germany's own fighter production choked and faltered. Allied bombing tore at factories. Material shortages forced desperate compromises. Quality control crumbled as experienced workers were sent to the front, replaced by desperate, often unwilling labor. Aircraft that should have been reliable became temperamental. Engines failed. Systems malfunctioned. The operational availability gap, that chasm Lurch had warned of, widened into an abyss. The Luftwaffe might boast more aircraft on paper, but fewer and fewer were actually combat-ready on any given day. American units, by stark contrast, maintained staggering operational readiness rates, a direct testament to the very design philosophy Lurch had lauded. Hans Vera Lurch, the unwavering engineer-pilot, survived the war. His logbook, a testament to his unparalleled skill and caution. Not a single crash or serious incident marring his record across 120 types. When Allied technical intelligence officers interrogated him, they found his reports a trove of uncomfortable truths. You concluded that American aircraft were superior not in performance but in operational design, an American officer observed. Lurch, a ghost of the past, simply nodded. It was the most important assessment. Your pilots weren't necessarily better. Your aircraft weren't necessarily faster or more maneuverable. But you could keep more aircraft flying more consistently. You could train more pilots. You could sustain operations that we couldn't. When asked if German leadership understood this, a bitter laugh escaped him. My report was filed. The assessment was that I'd been demoralized. German engineering was superior. American engineering was crude. Any evidence to the contrary was dismissed. The final numbers screamed the truth. Over 15600 P-47 Thunderbolts, one rolling off the line every hour at peak. Germany produced just 36000 single-engine fighters across all types during the entire war, constantly disrupted by the Allied onslaught. But the true devastation lay in operational readiness. American P-47 units boasting 85–90% availability, while German units struggled to keep 60–70% airborne. More aircraft produced times higher availability times better sustainability equaled an overwhelming, crushing numerical superiority at the point of contact. Lurch's memoir, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, became a poignant echo of his wartime insights. His assessment of the P-47, those technical observations, and the famous quote about the comfortable cockpit versus the cramped Bf-109 weren't just about an airplane. They were about a profound shift in the very nature of warfare. Germany, steeped in the glory of individual excellence and technological superiority, fought World War II as if it were still World War I. America, with its seemingly crude but relentlessly practical designs, fought it as an industrial war, a war of attrition, where sustained operations and overwhelming numbers would inevitably triumph. German fighters were magnificent machines, breathtaking thoroughbreds when they worked perfectly. But when they worked perfectly became a tragically rare occurrence. Manufacturing quality declined. Maintenance became a nightmare. Parts vanished. Fuel dried up. The P-47, by contrast, simply kept flying. It absorbed damage and brought its pilots home. It operated from muddy forward airfields. It could be maintained by average mechanics and flown safely by minimally trained pilots. And there were always more of them. Lurch had recognized this brutal truth immediately. His report from November 1943 was a prophecy meticulously detailed and chillingly accurate of the 18 months that would follow. But it was filed and forgotten because the truth, like a bitter pill, was too inconvenient to swallow. Hans Vera Lurch flew the P-47 Thunderbolt and immediately understood that it represented a superior approach to fighter design. Not superior performance, but superior operations. His reward was to be ignored, to watch his nation's Air Force, a symbol of its pride, be ground down by an enemy that could simply keep more aircraft flying more consistently. The lesson etched in the blood and oil of the Eastern and Western fronts is timeless. In sustained conflict, reliability beats peak performance. Operational availability beats maximum capability. And design philosophy, more than individual excellence, will ultimately determine who wins the war. The P-47 wasn't the flashiest or the fastest or the most agile fighter of World War II, but it might just have been the best designed fighter, because it was designed not for air shows or test flights or record-breaking feats. It was designed for war. And in war, the side that can keep fighting longest, the side that can keep its machines in the air relentlessly, always wins.